We're talking about something new, something that has been much buzzed about in the past few years in the church, has been this phenomena that's been labeled New Calvinism, and which, going to your point earlier, is really not that new at all.
Yes. Ever since I was a teenager, I have not kept up with the latest thing or the latest description. So I am by no means an expert on the New Calvinism. I'm still struggling to become an expert on the Old Calvinism, really. But in our culture, there's this tremendous drive to describe ourselves in a particular way that distinguishes us. Sometimes it's just to distinguish us from the present, but often it's to distinguish us from the past. And the striking thing I find about my own great heroes of the past is they didn't want to distinguish themselves from the past. They wanted to belong to the past in order that they might be grounded for the present, in order that they might hand on the gospel purely to the future. And I think that's a great tradition. Calvin, for example, he was so conscious of the fact he belonged to 1400 years of the church's history, and he wanted to belong to that and to work it out in his own time without distinguishing himself in some new way. In fact, whenever people distinguished Calvin and said, "You're doing something new," his response was always to say, "We're not doing anything new. We're just doing the same old thing in a different time as God moves along with us."
Well, let's talk about that. Many would say, fine, that's great to be connected to the past, but he didn't live in Manhattan. He didn't live in London of today, of the 21st century. Yeah. So isn't there an accommodation we need to make in the way we do ministry? This is the interesting thing, the way he accommodated was he realized that he could get people to listen to his preaching somewhere between 5 and 10 times a week. He lived in an era when preaching was despised, but it was the character of his preaching that actually revolutionized the city in which he was living. Calvin actually wasn't a citizen in Geneva till almost the end of his life. So everything he accomplished there and the massive church planting that emerged from Geneva was for him all the fruit of using the ordinary means of grace. Now, of course, he did that in Geneva. And to me, one of the wonderful things about especially reading Calvin's sermons, it doesn't come out in the institutes or in his tracts or in his letters in the same way, but in his sermons you realize that he is speaking to Geneva. He's really bringing the gospel to bear on the contemporary world. And I think that's our constant responsibility, the kind of thing that John Stott speaks about bringing the horizon of Scripture to bear upon the horizon of our times. What I have found personally is that what that really means is that you're getting to know Scripture better. I think part of the danger is that I think what I need to do is to get to know my world better. But if you get to know your world better, but don't get to know Scripture better, you're never going to be able to make the connection between the two. I think another thing that strikes me just because I've been around the block, and in God's providence I've got to know a fairly large number of significant figures in the church and thought leaders and people that might even be regarded as gurus, is that it's not often so clear from the fruit of their ministry what the actual root of that ministry is. And what has been very interesting to me is that knowing something of the root of those ministries, I think really simply underlines that if they've really been fruitful, what they have done is gone back to learn from the great masters, sit at their feet, and then ask the question, how am I going to speak this same gospel, not in the accent of the 17th century or the 20th century even, but how am I going to speak it to these people to whom I address myself? How am I going to live among them, get to know who they are? And at the end of the day, that's what every pastor does. My responsibility in Colombia, which isn't Chicago or Dallas or San Francisco, is to get to know how my people think, to get to know what sin sounds like and looks like in its own particular culture. And I'm going to be able to do that, I think, best of all, by immersing myself in the Scriptures and my ability to bring the Scriptures to bear upon our lives so that they get under the cultural surface to the heart. Because our calling in life is not to regenerate the culture. Calling in life is to see people come to faith in Jesus Christ.